My apologies for my little at the end of the last video. I got so excited about telling you about that troubleshooting that I made it sound like that was the end of this section. It's definitely not. We've got some TCP UDP material to hit here. And of course, this is a very important exam topic. We're going to take about 15 seconds here to discuss the similarities between the two. They both operated the transport layer of the OSI model. That part we knew. And they both perform a little something called multiplexing. Well, you knew the first one, and we're going to talk about the second one in this section, and that's really about it for similarities. Let's talk about some differences and some characteristics of the two. First off, TCP, it guarantees delivery of our segments. That sounds like a pretty good deal. It performs error detection as well. It performs windowing, whatever that is. If you don't know what it is, we're going to get to that. And then connection-oriented, which means that a two-way communication between our endpoints is going to take place before data is actually exchanged. Sounds kind of like an adjacency. It's not an adjacency per se like OSPF or EIGRP, but those protocols have an underlying connection before they start sending packets. Well, here TCP has an underlying connection, a control connection that it's going to make between the two partners before they can start sending segments. That all sounds great. Well, let's talk about UDP. UDP has what we call best effort delivery, which is good, but not guaranteed. It's really the analogy I've seen and used myself over the years is the post office. You go to the post office, you put a letter in the mailbox, and you don't really have a guarantee from them that it's going to get where it's going, but it usually does, unless there's a check involved. Now, there's no error detection due to, we don't have any sequence numbers, we don't have any ACK numbers, and we don't have any error detection. We don't have any ACK numbers either. We don't have any numbers at all. There's no windowing, and it's connectionless, which means there's no pregame communication, if you will, between the two endpoints. The data exchange just simply starts, and that's it. So even if you don't know what windowing is, you have to admit that TCP already sounds a lot better than UDP. Because the very first characteristic of each, where TCP guarantees delivery of segments, while UDP doesn't guarantee it, that sounds like enough for me to use TCP for everything and UDP for nothing. And that's not the case in real-world networking, though. Many vital protocols, including the protocol that handles the very important work of dynamically assigning IP addresses, that's as important as it gets, it's DHCP, that uses UDP. And on top of that, the two most delay-sensitive types of network traffic we have, voice and video, they use UDP. Why? Well, the one-word answer might come to you as we go through the overall operation of both protocols, starting with TCP and a curious little something we call the three-way handshake. And you've probably shaken hands many times in your life, but have you ever really taken part in a three-way handshake? How can you even have a three-way handshake? Even if you do the, Wonder Powers activate, fist knock, it's still a fist knock, it's still just two. How do you get a third party in a handshake? Well, here's how and here's why we have that with TCP. Because as I mentioned, there's a control connection. There's an underlying connection between the two parties that has to be built before any segments are transmitted. And the involved devices have to agree on some basic parameters before any transmissions can happen. Again, this is not an adjacency per se, but you'll notice the concepts are the same if you're familiar with those. If not, we're getting to those with routing protocols later. There has to be an agreement on some basic values before the transmissions can happen with TCP. That includes what we call the initial sequence number, the ISN. They have to agree on that. And here's how the handshake proceeds. The initiating server is going to send a TCP segment with the SYN bit set, that's SYN, and that SYN is short for synchronization. And the primary value being synchronized is the TCP sequence number. Now the recipient is going to respond with a TCP segment of its own, and this one has the ACK bit set as well as the SYN bit, which is why we call this a SYN ACK. Now part of that SYN ACK is the server acknowledging receipt of the original SYN, that's SYN again, so it makes sense that the server getting the SYN ACK needs to acknowledge, hey, I got your original synchronization packet or segment. And that's the final step of our three-way handshake, is that the original sender is going to say, okay, I got your SYN ACK. So there's a lot of acknowledging going on there. So summing up, the initiating server is going to send a SYN in an effort to synchronize TCP values with the recipient, with the other endpoint. The receiving server sends a SYN ACK back for two reasons. First, to acknowledge the recipient of the original SYN and to further the synchronization process. And then finally, the initiating server sends an ACK to let the other server know the SYN ACK was received, and that's the end of the handshake. So we've got, everybody has acknowledged everybody else in that communication. Now, let's take a look at the three-way handshake in UDP. There isn't one. So that kind of sounds like another strike against UDP. Now, let's look at another TCP feature here. Now, this is technically not error detection, but it's a very important concept of TCP. It's how TCP realizes that segments have been lost and how TCP recovers from lost segments. Now, the TCP header contains separate fields for the sequence number and the acknowledgement number, and it's those two values that allow TCP to detect and recover from lost segments. In this example, one host is sending 4 segments to another, and each of the segments has a sequence number, and it's that sequence number that tells the recipient in what order the segments should be reassembled. Now, we've got 4 1500 byte segments transmitted, and I am pulling sequence numbers out of the sky, starting with 1500 and then incrementing by 1500. In real life, these values can be 8, 9, 10 digits long, even longer. So once the 4 segments are received by server 2, it would be a good idea to let server 1 know that the segments arrived safely. Now, the server receiving those segments is going to do that by sending a segment back to S1 but without any data in the segment. Now, the ACK number will be set, but it will not be set to the number of the last segment server 2 received, as you might expect. Instead, it's going to be the number of the data segment server 2 expects to see, and with this pattern, it would be 7500. That's the way the sequence number works. When it gets sent back, it's like, okay, here's the next segment number I expect to see from you. Now, the natural assumption is that the ACK would be set to 6000, right? It's like, hey, the last one I got was 6000. But when server 2 tells server 1 the next segment number it expects to see, we call this a cumulative acknowledgement scheme, and that allows TCP to realize when segments have been lost. So here in this next example, one of the segments got lost, the one with sequence 3000. And what server 2 is going to end up doing is sending an ACK of 3000 back to server 1. Basically, the server 2 is indicating, yeah, you might have skipped one here because I'm expecting to see a 3000. Now, when server 1 sees that ACK of 3000 coming in, it's going to know the segment with sequence number 3000 wasn't seen, so then server 1 will retransmit that particular segment. And then server 2 will send an ACK for that retransmitted segment, indicating the next sequence number it expects to see. And that's really all there is to it. The key there is just remembering that the acknowledgement is always going to be saying, here's what I expect to see from you next. Now, in networking studies, as in life, one answer leads to another question. And in this case, the obvious question is, well, how does server 1 know how many segments it can send before it has to receive an ACK? Well, there's another question that kind of comes from that as well. Why doesn't the recipient just send an ACK for every segment it receives? Well, the reasons are flow control and windowing. And let's go back to that three-way handshake for a moment. Now, we know that during that handshake, parameters are negotiated and agreed upon, and I mentioned one of those being the initial sequence number, the ISN. Now, another value that's negotiated during this handshake is the initial size of the window, which determines how many bytes of data the recipient is willing to accept before it has to send an ACK. And notice this is the initial size of the window. It's vital to remember that the size of the window is dynamic. It's not static. because as the recipient realizes that it can handle that initial amount of data effectively without dropping segments, the recipient says, hey, you know what? This transmission is fine, this speed is fine. Let's raise the window size a little bit. I'll accept more data before I have to send you an ACK. And that's just the way it goes. So to reiterate a couple of points here, the initial size of that window is negotiated and agreed upon during the three-way handshake. The size of the window is expressed in bytes, and the size of the window is dynamic, and it's changed by the recipient, not the sender. The sender can't just say, well, I'm just going to keep on speeding up until you tell me otherwise. This flow control can raise or lower the size of the window, because as that recipient starts to drop some segments, it's going to start saying, wait a minute, we're going too fast. We're going too fast here. Lower that size a little bit. Let's lower the size of the window. And that's why we refer to it as a sliding window. It can slide up or it can slide back. And the recipient, of course, will lower the size of the window as it sees that errors or dropped segments are starting to creep in. And you can see why this is such a fantastic feature, because it allows the segment transmission to stay close to the maximum speed while also letting the recipient slow the flow down when transmission is too fast and segments start getting dropped. UDP's flow control, well, there isn't any. Well, right now TCP is looking pretty darn good and UDP really isn't. And right now, we're going to pause here and move to the next video. We're going to talk about UDP's advantage over TCP, because we keep talking this badly about UDP. UDP is going to sue me. So I'm going to tell you the rest of this story here on the next video. No copyright intended there either. And we'll talk about why every network service in the world just doesn't use TCP. I'll see you on the next vid.